But the problem with that is with our deep squat, we're not actually overloading the joint angles that we need in the approach jump. So in an approach jump, it's very rare that we get down lower than 90 degrees, right? So we're working with a smaller range of motion than what we would be working with in the deep squat or even in the parallel squat. And so in my last video, I talked about why a quarter squat makes a lot more sense for trained athletes, and we can increase force potential with a heavy quarter squat. Now, we have decades of research showing that strength improvements only occur at or near the joint angles where training occurs. Now, we see this in study after study. One of the most revealing studies is by Matthew Rea, and I'll give you guys a couple quotes from that study. Conventional thought has suggested that athletes must train through a full range of motion to ensure adaptations at all joint angles. Given the data of the current study, it seems that strength improvements are specific to joint angles that are sufficiently overloaded, not just joint angles where training occurs, right? So you might think, well, hey, in a deep squat, I train all joint angles, therefore I get strong at all joint angles. Well, the problem is the literature also shows that we can quarter squat 20 to 30% more than we can deep squat. Therefore, if I'm doing deep squats, I'm now limited in the weight that I can use, and the limiting factor are those deep joint angles. So the angles that I actually need for jumping and even for sprinting are not being overloaded. So what's being overloaded is that bottom position, and then I'm building up momentum, and then as soon as I get to the joint angles that actually matter, I already have momentum, and now I just breeze right through that top end of the range of motion, and now I'm not actually overloading the joint angles that matter. Here's another important point from that Matthew Rea study. Using 1RM testing at full squat depths to calculate and apply training loads through a full squat range of motion results in training loads at the top of the range of motion representing less than 70% of maximum lifting capacity in that range of motion. Consistently training at 60 to 80% of maximum capacity may promote strength gains in less trained populations, aka beginners, just about anything works, but would not be considered sufficient for optimal strength development among more highly trained populations, right? So what they're suggesting in that study is that in that quarter position, remember the angles that actually matter for vertical jump, in those angles, we're only training at a 70% load. So we are not sufficiently overloading the angles that actually matter. And now I know where your mind naturally goes, and we addressed this a little bit in my last video. But Paul, what if I put bands on or I put chains on, right? Accommodating resistance. Now it's making it harder at the top. Now, isn't it the best of both worlds? We sufficiently train the deep ranges and we also train the upper range. Well, not so fast, because remember in jumping, let's look at an approach jump. I'm dropping and then I'm stopping myself at these specific angles and then I'm producing force. In a full squat with bands, I'm going all the way down. I put the braking force on in the very bottom. So I'm not stopping myself in the angles that matter. I'm stopping myself lower, and then I'm building up momentum and driving through. And so yes, concentrically, I get a little bit of work in that top range, but eccentrically, I got no work. Isometrically, I got no work. And so we're skipping two of the phases that really matter for improving explosiveness. Now, I understand that deep squats and parallel squats work your muscles better, and I understand that it's far better for hypertrophy, especially of selective muscle groups. But that's not what approach jumping is about. So of course, in the quarter squat position, we're in a good biomechanical position to produce force. Now, if I take that away and we put you in a deep squat, now we're in a biomechanical disadvantage, which gives you an opportunity to work your muscles harder. Unfortunately, that's just not what the approach jump is about. The approach jump is not about working our muscles harder. If that were the case, we would see bodybuilders jumping really high. They work their muscles harder. They have bigger quads than any really good jumper out there. In fact, majority of really good approach jumpers have tiny little thighs. When you look at high jumpers, tiny thighs. When you look at the best dunkers in the NBA, 90% of the time, very little quad hypertrophy, glute hypertrophy. Ja Morant, Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant. When I look at pro dunkers that I train, of the top 5 verticals that I've ever seen in my life, I think only one of them had decent quad size. The others had never touched a weight in their life. So when you make the argument from a hypertrophy standpoint, I think that that's a misinterpretation of bigger cross-sectional area leads to more force. Yes, at slow speeds, but as we've talked about before, there's also potential that when we increase hypertrophy, we're increasing internal moment arm length, which then slows down the contraction velocity. And so hypertrophy is an essential adaptation to increasing force potential at slow speeds. But at high speeds, it might not translate because that adaptation of getting bigger quads or getting bigger glutes might actually slow down contraction velocity. And what you see is, if you're a stick figure, brand new, some hypertrophy could be good, but very early on, that scale tips, and at some point, more hypertrophy becomes bad. Now, of course, this is when we're talking about approach jumping. Standing vertical jump, maybe a little bit more quad hypertrophy is beneficial. A lot of football players jump really high. Is it because they squatted their way there, or is it because they're fast twitch freaks, which is why they chose football? They were good, they were explosive. Football is perfect for fast twitch freaks. You can go and stop and recover, and go and stop and recover. And so what I've noticed is even football players who don't squat and don't do any heavy lifting still jump out of the gym because they're just fast twitch freaks. So the fast twitch and their anthropometrics is what helps them succeed in the vertical jump. And that's also what helps them succeed in the squat. So it's not necessarily the squat that's helping them succeed in the vertical jump. But again, if you're looking at jumping from a hypertrophy standpoint, we're looking in the wrong area. You're not gonna find any real correlation in trained athletes. You're gonna find some guys that have jacked quads that jump high. You're gonna find some guys that have zero hypertrophy, but still have the fast twitch and the fascia, the tendon elasticity to jump high. And so to look at it from a hypertrophy standpoint is just the wrong way to look at it. And so for some injury prevention, maybe other reasons, being more physical on the court, I still like to get guys a little bit bigger typically. But from an approach jump standpoint, and that's all we're talking about here is approach jump. From an approach jump standpoint, we don't want a lot of lower body hypertrophy. So the reason that I bring that up is because I know that some people are just stuck in that mindset of whatever works your muscles better is going to be better for approach jumping. That's just not the case. If that were the case, I would be doing so many knee extensions. I would be on the knee extension machine getting my quads jacked. The EMG is super high. We could build some really good quad hypertrophy. We know that that does not translate from decades of literature. We know that's not going to translate to a jump, or especially to an approach jump or to sprint speed. So don't look at things in terms of what works your muscles better. Look at things in terms of how can we apply more force into the ground, and not just more force over time. What exercises specifically lead to a higher peak force than what I can see in jumping? To me, those are the only exercises that are going to increase force potential, which later on may show up in jumping as long as we get enough specific approach jump practice. Stay tuned for the next installment of this squat variation series. Remember, we are not looking at high velocity exercises, power exercises. In this series, we're looking at actual heavy strength training and finding out, is there any exercise that's actually worth the investment of my energy and my time when it comes to jumping higher? See you next time.